The beam of the lighthouse cut through the storm, illuminating the drenched cliffs for just a moment, and that's when I saw it. Something was perched at the edge, crouched low like a predator. Its face, if it even was a face, gleamed wet and pale in the rain, eyes too wide, too reflective, like pools of black water. I froze, the breath stolen from my lungs as his head snapped toward me. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Long, spindly arms stretched out, claws scraping against the rock with a sound that made my stomach churn. Then it stood, impossibly tall and bent, its twisted form tilting in the wind. It was staring at me. And then it moved. The wind howled through the cracks in Ethan's cottage, rattling the windows like impatient fingers. He sat hunched over his sketchpad, the lighthouse a jagged silhouette on the page. The isolation was what he had wanted, needed really. After the breakup, the city suffocating. Noise had made him feel trapped, so he'd packed everything and driven until the ocean swallowed the horizon. This cottage had seemed perfect, small, lonely, with the lighthouse in view. But now, as the storm lashed at the coast, he felt something new, something uninvited. A low, gnawing unease crept in as he caught himself staring out the window, waiting for something he couldn't name. The next morning, Ethan headed into the village for supplies, the uneasy feeling from the night before still prickling at the back of his neck. The small grocery store smelled of salt and old wood, and the murmurs of two elderly men caught his attention. "The warden keeps it quiet up there," one said, nodding toward the cliffs. "Quiet until he don't," the other replied, his voice low. Ethan leaned in at the counter, curiosity overcoming his caution. "The warden?" The shopkeeper's face turned grim. "Old story," he said, tossing Ethan a packet of coffee. "Lighthouse keeper went mad, or drowned. Depends who you ask. Some say he's still up there, keeping watch. Others," his voice dropped, "others say he ain't human anymore." Ethan chuckled nervously, but felt the weight of the man's words settle on his chest. That afternoon, sketchbook in hand, Ethan set off toward the lighthouse. As he approached, its towering frame loomed larger than he expected, casting an eerie shadow over the jagged rocks. The door was bolted, rusted shut, but faint rhythmic sounds came from within, a scraping, like nails on glass. He pressed his ear against the cold metal, heart racing. From deep inside, something tapped back. The first time Ethan saw it again, he almost convinced himself it wasn't real. The lighthouse beam cut across the cliffs, briefly revealing the silhouette, taller this time, impossibly lanky, its limbs bent like broken branches. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told himself it was a trick of the light. But when the beam passed again, it was still there, closer now, watching. The next night, it returned. It didn't move, but Ethan felt its presence gnawing at his thoughts. Each time the light swept across, it seemed less human, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its chest seemed to ripple, as if something inside was shifting under the skin. He shut the curtains, heart pounding, but that didn't help. He could feel its gaze, sharp and unyielding, piercing through the walls. The unease seeped into his days. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. The shadows in his cottage seemed wrong, longer than they should be. He'd glance at his sketches only to find figures he didn't remember drawing, tall, angular shapes looming behind jagged cliffs. At night, the cottage came alive with faint, rhythmic sounds, a soft tapping at the windows, a creak in the floorboards as though someone, or something, was walking inside. He told himself it was the wind. It had to be the wind, but when he pressed his ear against the window, the tapping stopped, only to start again at the back door. Then, one night, a scream cut through the storm. It wasn't human, high-pitched, garbled as though dragged through water. It came from the lighthouse, carried on the wind. Ethan froze. The scream came again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural moan. He clutched his chest as dread bloomed inside him. Someone, or something, was in the lighthouse. Ethan sat in the dim light of his cottage, clutching his flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned. White. The scream still echoed in his ears, a sound that didn't belong to anything he could name. He couldn't stay still anymore. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, every gust of wind scraped against the walls like claws. He had to know what was happening at the lighthouse. Grabbing his flashlight, a pocket knife, and his sketchbook almost as an afterthought, Ethan stepped into the storm. The rain was relentless, stabbing his skin like cold needles. The path to the lighthouse was more treacherous than he remembered. Waves crashed violently against the cliffs, sending sprays of salt water high into the air. His flashlight flickered as he trudged forward, the beam catching jagged rocks and pools of water. Then he saw them, footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the wet sand, elongated and webbed as though left by something that belonged in the depths of the ocean. They led directly to the lighthouse, disappearing into the darkness ahead. Ethan hesitated, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His rational mind screamed for him to turn back, but something stronger, a mix of fear and a sick need for answers, propelled him forward. When he reached the lighthouse, his heart sank. The door, which had been locked and rusted shut during the day, now hung ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. The inside was pitch black, a yawning void that seemed to pull at him. He stepped inside and the smell hit him first, brine and something sour, like rotting fish. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest. As he moved deeper, the door creaked closed behind him, with an ominous finality. From somewhere above, deep within the lighthouse, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he climbed the spiral staircase, each step creaking under his weight. The flashlight's beam swept over the walls, revealing slimy barnacles and clumps of seaweed clinging to the stone. The air was damp and thick as though he were underwater, and every breath felt like it carried the weight of the ocean. The footprints were clearer here, webbed and slick, leaving a faint, shimmering residue. They climbed higher, leading into the suffocating dark above. Ethan paused, gripping the railing as his flashlight flickered again. A sound broke the silence, a wet, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the floor just ahead. His chest tightened. He couldn't tell if it was coming from above or below, but it was close, too close. On the second floor, the staircase opened into a small, cluttered room. Rusted tools lay scattered across the floor, alongside broken furniture and shattered glass. In the corner, partially hidden under a pile of rotting netting, Ethan saw a book, its leather cover swollen and discolored from water damage. He picked it up hesitantly, the pages sticking together as he flipped through. The entries were erratic, scrawled in jagged handwriting. It watches from the depths. It cannot be ignored. Dreams are no longer my own. It stares because it waits. It waits because it hungers. Ethan's hands trembled. He turned another page and froze. The final entry was an illustration, a crude but terrifying sketch of a monstrous figure, its eyes glowing like lanterns, staring through the window of the lighthouse. A sound, a low, guttural growl, snapped Ethan's attention upward. The staircase loomed ahead, curling into darkness. He climbed, his flashlight shaking in his grip. At the top, he stopped. The figure stood before the window, illuminated by the storm's lightning. Its skin glistened, fish-like and wet, stretching over a twisted humanoid form. Its glowing eyes locking onto him. It didn't move. But Ethan knew it had seen him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the figure. Its body gleamed in the sporadic flashes of lightning, every movement unnervingly deliberate. But it didn't lunge. It didn't attack. Instead, it turned, stepping aside with an alien grace, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Ethan hesitated, the beam of his flashlight trembling as it swept over the wall. That's when he saw them, symbols, jagged and ancient, carved deep into the stone. They spiraled outward in a chaotic pattern, overlapping in a way that seemed purposeful, as though they were holding something in. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon, it was a barrier. And something was trying to break through. The figure moved again, its long arm extending unnaturally to point at the floor. Ethan followed. The motion, his eyes landing on a rusted trapdoor he hadn't noticed before. As he caught the faint sound of water sloshing below, rhythmic and wrong, as though something enormous was shifting beneath the lighthouse. "No," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. "I'm not going down there." The figure didn't react. It simply stood, watching him with its unblinking, inhuman eyes, waiting. Ethan swallowed hard, his hand trembling as it reached for the trapdoor's handle. The air grew colder as Ethan descended the ladder, the metallic rungs slick with moisture. At the bottom, his boots splashed into ankle-deep water, the cavern stretching out before him. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of the walls encrusted with barnacles and writhing seaweed. And then he saw it, the shadows, massive, sinuous forms gliding beneath the surface, their movements deliberate and predatory. A voice, low and guttural, rippled through the cavern. The words were incomprehensible, but their intent was clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as the shadows began to rise, the water rippling around. Them. The cavern seemed alive now, pulsating with a deep thrumming sound that reverberated through Ethan's chest. He stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in his grip as the shadows beneath the water rose higher. A sickly pale glow began to emanate from the depths, casting long, flickering shapes onto the walls. Then, from the shadows, it emerged. The figure from the lighthouse was there, standing impossibly still beside him. It hadn't followed him down the ladder, but now it stood only feet away, its reflective eyes burning like twin lanterns in the gloom. The wet, fish-like skin glistened as it tilted its head, moving with a deliberate, unnatural grace. It raised one elongated arm, not to attack, but to gesture, to the water, to the rising forms within. Ethan's heart pounded as his mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. As Ethan's flashlight flickered again, the voice from the water became clearer. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a sensation that seemed to press against his mind. The words twisted in his head, foreign and ancient, but their meaning was undeniable. It must be contained. His gaze darted back to the figure, then to the carving on the walls. The journal's words flashed through his mind. "It stares because it waits. It waits because it hungers." The warden wasn't just a keeper. It was a sacrifice, a prison guard shackled to its duty. The figure took a step closer and Ethan staggered back, his feet splashing in the water. The voice grew louder, demanding now. It offered a choice, its words pressing into him like cold iron. Take the warden's place or the barrier will fall. The meaning was clear. Either he stayed, bound to this cursed lighthouse forever, or he left, unleashing the horrors in the depths onto the world above. Ethan's breath hitched as the water rippled again, a massive shadow rising beneath him. He had seconds to decide, and he wasn't sure if there was a right choice. Ethan's chest heaved as he stood frozen in the icy water of the cavern. The voice was relentless. Now, hammering into his skull, each word sinking deeper into his resolve. Take its place. The figure loomed over him, unmoving but expectant. Its alien gaze bored into him, silent yet demanding. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't. I won't." The figure's head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement that felt almost human, almost regretful. Then it stepped forward, blocking the ladder. Ethan stumbled back, heart pounding as the cavern shuddered around him. The water beneath him rippled violently, as though something massive was waking. Without thinking, Ethan turned and splashed toward the far wall of the cavern, slipping and stumbling as the water rose around him. Behind him, the figure followed, its wet, unnatural footsteps echoing with a deliberate, methodical rhythm. The lighthouse trembled above them, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly before flickering out like dying embers. The voice in his mind grew angrier, sharper. Flee, and you doom them all. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed forward, gripping the ladder at the far end of the cavern. He scrambled up, his hands slipping on the slick rungs as the figure reached the base. A guttural, unnatural screech tore through the air as it began to climb after him, faster than he thought possible. Ethan burst out of the trapdoor, gasping for air as the storm lashed at him. The lighthouse shook violently now, the windows cracking as if under immense pressure. He bolted for the staircase, but the figure was close behind, its glowing eyes cutting through the dark. Reaching the top, Ethan didn't hesitate. He flung himself through the shattered window into the storm. The wind tore at him as he fell, the rocks and waves rushing up to meet him. He hit the water with bone-jarring force, sinking into the freezing depths as he clawed his way. To the surface, he felt them, cold, slimy hands wrapping around his ankles, dragging him down. He kicked wildly, gasping as he broke free and swam for shore, the weight of unseen things pulling at him all the way. When Ethan finally stumbled onto the beach, coughing and shaking, he glanced back at the lighthouse. The beam of light had gone dark, the storm swallowing it whole, but the faint glow from the cavern remained, pulsing like a heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside, he could still hear the voice. It wasn't angry anymore. It was laughing. Ethan sat trembling in his cottage, wrapped in a damp blanket that did little to warm him. Fire in the hearth sputtered, barely cutting through the suffocating cold that seemed to cling to him since the lighthouse. His body ached, his lungs still raw from the salt water he'd swallowed. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. He stared at his sketchbook, the pages warped from moisture. His hand hovered over a blank
sheet, the pencil trembling between his fingers. Then he saw it, grotesque, slithering shapes.
Already sketched on the page, though he had no memory of drawing them. Their eyes were glowing, familiar, and unblinking. Ethan shoved the book away, heart pounding. Every time he closed his eyes, the cavern came back to him. The whispers, the shadows, the weight of that monstrous presence pressing into his mind. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, the sound of crashing waves roared through his skull, too loud and too close. The next day, Ethan noticed the lighthouse. It was dark, its beam extinguished. From the window, he could see the storm had passed, but the cliffs remained eerie, shrouded in an unnatural stillness. When he ventured into the village, the shopkeeper met him with a worried frown. "You see it?" he asked. Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. "Something's wrong," the man muttered, his voice low. "We've been hearing sounds from the cliffs. Something big. Something. Alive." Ethan's stomach turned, but he said nothing. That night, the dream came. He was back in the lighthouse, standing at the top where the warden once stood. But this time, the figure wasn't watching him. It was staring out at the sea, motionless and tense. The water churned below, dark shapes rising, writhing. The voice came again, soft and knowing. "It stares because it waits. It waits because it hungers. Ethan woke drenched in sweat, the sound of waves crashing just outside his window. Only the sea was miles away. Ethan awoke to a sound that froze him, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the walls of the cottage, like a heartbeat reverberating in the dark. He bolted upright, clutching the blanket to his chest, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, as though the ocean itself were crawling toward him. He rushed to the window. The lighthouse beam was back, sweeping across the cliffs with an unnatural rhythm. But something was wrong. The light wasn't steady. It pulsed, flickering like a dying star. And in the brief moments of darkness, shadows rippled across the cliffs. Not one, but many, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. Then, the beam froze, locked onto his cottage. Ethan stumbled back, tripping over the rug, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls became a roar, the sound of crashing waves and guttural whispers blending into a Cacophony. He clutched his ears, but the sound wasn't outside. It was inside his head. And then he felt it, a presence behind him. He turned slowly, trembling. His sketchbook lay open on the desk, but it wasn't blank anymore. A new drawing had appeared, one he hadn't made, an image of the lighthouse, its light shining. Straight into the cottage. In the window of the sketch, he saw himself, and standing behind him was the figure from the lighthouse, its glowing eyes fixed on his. The roaring stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the
sketch, his reflection distorted in glossy, inhuman eyes of the warden.
From the cliffs, the lighthouse beam flickered once more, and then went dark. In the morning, the villagers found his cottage abandoned. His belongings were untouched. Except for the sketchbook on the desk, the last drawing showed Ethan standing in the lighthouse, his face blank, his body distorted like the warden's. That night, the light from the lighthouse returned. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling draws its gaze closer to you. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story, or is something already staring back? The sound woke me, a sharp, unnatural melody that didn't belong in the canyon, rising and falling like a voice trying to sing but failing. My eyes snapped open to darkness, but it wasn't the kind you get when you close your eyes. It was alive. Something was crouching just outside my tent, its silhouette outlined by the dim light of the moon. Then it moved, slow, deliberate, dragging long, spindly fingers across the fabric. Chest tightened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the distance anymore. It was coming from inside my tent. And then it whispered my name. Jack's breath was shallow, each inhale laced with an uneasy chill. Grown faint, teasing him like a phantom, just out of reach. Shadows from the canyon. Walls stretched like claws as night fell, their jagged edges slicing into the dim glow of his flashlight. The path ahead was almost indistinguishable, tangled with vines and loose rocks that shifted ominously underfoot. It felt wrong, like the land itself was rejecting him. Suddenly, the sound returned, a single piercing note that stopped Jack in his tracks. His pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the encroaching darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a flash of something pale and quick disappearing behind a boulder. He whipped his flashlight toward it, but the beam revealed only emptiness. The air changed, carrying a metallic tang so sharp it made Jack gag. He reached out, instinctively, and his hand grazed something cold, impossibly cold, like ice in the desert. He spun around, heart-hammering, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling lingered, an icy residue clinging to his skin. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking against the oppressive silence. He stumbled forward, his flashlight catching on something strange. An abandoned campsite. A fire pit, long extinguished, sat surrounded by rocks and a single backpack. Leaned against a toppled tent, Jack hesitated before kneeling to inspect it. The zipper creaked as he opened it, revealing a dusty water bottle and a journal with cracked leather binding. Flipping through the pages, his stump tightened. Scribbled words filled the journal, chaotic and frantic. The sound is alive. It watches. It knows. Near the bottom of the page, scrawled in shaking letters, he read, "The echo doesn't stop. It takes." A twig snapped behind him. Jack froze, the sound of the snapping twig reverberating in the quiet canyon. He spun toward the noise, flashlight trembling in his hand, but the beam revealed only the yawning dark. His breath quickened as a sharp gust of wind whipped through the clearing, scattering loose dirt and causing the journal's pages to flutter violently. The sound returned, distant at first, like a hum carried on the wind. It twisted in his ears, growing erratic and disjointed. Jack glanced at his phone, desperate for a distraction. But his heart sank. No signal. Worse, the GPS now displayed nothing but a gray, featureless void. He wasn't just lost. According to the device, this place didn't exist. He stumbled forward, trying to retrace his steps, but the ground was treacherous. Rocks shifted beneath his boots, and the canyon's steep edges seemed closer now, like the walls were closing in. Then, without warning, the sound erupted directly behind him. Startled, Jack lurched forward, nearly tumbling into a jagged ravine. He caught himself just in time, his palm scraping against the sharp rocks. When he looked up, something moved. It was quick, darting from one shadow to the next, a tall, angular shape that didn't seem to walk so much as glide. Jack's throat tightened as he trained his flashlight toward the movement, but it revealed only empty space. He pressed on, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but the flashlight began to flicker, its beam sputtering and dimming. That's when he felt it, a rush of cold air, as though something had passed by him, through him. His chest, and then he heard it. A low, guttural whisper, unmistakable in its clarity, wrapped around him like a vice. Jack, Jack. The clearing appeared suddenly, as though the canyon had spat him out into an open. Wound in the earth, Jack's flashlight flickered weakly, but the moon illuminated enough to make him freeze in place. At the center of the clearing stood a towering altar, black and jagged, its surface carved with the same spirals and jagged symbols he'd seen earlier. The stone seemed to absorb the light, pulsing faintly as if it were alive. Around the altar, skeletal remains lay in twisted patterns, rib cages arched like grotesque wings, skulls stacked in concentric circles, each one bearing an expression of terror. Jack's stomach churned as he stepped closer, unable to stop himself. The air was colder here, thick with the smell of decay despite the dryness of the desert. He glanced down and saw a shard of obsidian embedded in the altar's base, smooth and reflective like black glass. Against every instinct screaming in his head, Jack knelt to inspect it. His face stared back at him from the shard, but something was wrong. His reflection's eyes were too wide, and its mouth curled into a slow, deliberate smile. One he wasn't making. He staggered back, his pulse thundering in his ears. The sound erupted again, louder than ever, but it was no longer outside of him. His skull vibrating through his teeth, piercing his thoughts. Jack clutched his head, gasping as visions flashed behind his eyes, people screaming, their faces contorted as they were pulled into darkness. He felt something tugging at his mind, peeling away his memories, his thoughts, him. No, he screamed, stumbling away from the altar, but the ground felt unsteady, the canyon spinning around him as if it were alive. The sound surged again, and Jack realized it wasn't a noise, it was a presence, and it wanted him. The sound shattered into a piercing shriek, and the air in the clearing seemed to ripple like disturbed water. Jack stumbled backward as the ripples coalesced, pulling the darkness together into a figure. At first, it was indistinct, its form fluid and shifting as though it were made of ink spilled across the night. Then, it solidified into something humanoid, tall and slender but wrong, its limbs unnaturally long, its proportions skewed. Where its face should have been was an empty void, an endless blackness that seemed to draw the light and air into it. Jack couldn't move, rooted to the ground by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as though studying him. Then it opened its mouth, or what should have been a mouth. Instead, the void expanded, and the sound came again, this time directly inside Jack's skull. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a voice. Alone, the word echoed in his mind, not in his ears. You're mine. Visions exploded behind Jack's eyes. He saw faces, dozens maybe, hundreds, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams as they were pulled into the darkness. The sensation was unbearable, like someone peeling layers of him away, exposing everything he was. He tried to hold on to his thoughts, his name, his memories, but they were slipping through his fingers, melting like ice in the sun. No! Jack roared, lurching toward the altar. His hand closed around the obsidian shard. its sharp edge biting into his palm. Without thinking, he slammed it against the altar's surface. The black stone cracked, a spider web of fractures racing across its surface. The figure faltered, its form flickering like a dying flame. The sound stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The ground trembled, and Jack didn't wait to see what came next. He turned and ran, the clearing dissolving into chaos behind him. But even as he fled, he could feel it, the void, the presence, still watching, still waiting. Jack's boots pounded against the uneven canyon floor as he ran, the sound of his own ragged breath barely masking the guttural whispers behind him. The void was chasing him. He couldn't see it, but he felt it, a pulling sensation in his chest as if invisible strings were dragging him backward. The air had thickened, pressing against him like unseen hands. The sound erupted again, wild and erratic, slamming into him from all directions. Jack stumbled and fell hard, the flashlight flying from his grip and shattering against a rock. Darkness consumed him. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up, only to freeze. He was back at the abandoned campsite. The fire pit was still there, but now it glowed faintly, embers sparking to life where there had been only ash. The journal was gone, in its place a single bloody handprint smeared the rock. Fresh. Almost mocking. A shadow moved ahead, and Jack turned to face it. The figure materialized again, taller, more solid, the void of its face larger and hungrier. It tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring his terror. Then it spoke, not in his head this time, but aloud, its voice an agonized mixture of screams and whispers. "You cannot run. You are mine." Jack backed away, his feet slipping on the gravel until he found himself at the edge of a cliff. The canyon yawned open behind him, a sheer drop into darkness reached for him, its elongated fingers stretching unnaturally. "Stay back," Jack shouted, his voice breaking. But he knew it wouldn't stop. With no other choice, he turned and leapt into the abyss. As he fell, the sound followed, twisting into a laugh that promised he hadn't escaped, only delayed the inevitable. Jack woke to the sensation of cold stone beneath him, his body aching as though he'd been crushed and reassembled. His eyes fluttered open to a faint dawn light creeping into the canyon. He was at the entrance, lying amidst scattered rocks and dust. The oppressive sound, the echo, was gone. The canyon felt still again, empty and ordinary. He sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in his ribs. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he noticed the screen was intact, the GPS functioning perfectly. But the map was blank, no trace of the canyon, no record of where he'd been. He staggered to his feet, glancing back. The jagged cliffs were now unremarkable walls of rock, no altar, no symbols, no shadows. Relief flooded him as he left the canyon behind, his mind desperate to rationalize everything. A nightmare, he muttered, forcing the words through his dry throat. It was just a nightmare. But the nightmare followed him home. Jack first noticed it in his reflection. As he washed his face in the bathroom mirror, his movements felt wrong. There was a lag, a fleeting but undeniable delay in his reflection's blink, a hesitation before it mimicked a smile. Then came the whispers, soft and intermittent, crawling through the silence of his apartment. He told himself it was the wind, the pipes, anything but what he knew it was. That night the sound returned, faint at first, weaving through his dreams, tugging at his thoughts. But as he jolted awake, the truth hit him like a cold wave. The sound wasn't in his head. It was in his house. He froze, his breath caught in his throat as the sound grew louder, closer. And then it whispered his name. "Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story, or has the echo found its way into your silence too?"